Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to be finishing up our API project for the random quote machine for freeCodeCamp, the intermediate challenge thing, whatever it's called. Anyway, we have a basic running app. Okay, now all we need to do is clean it up a little bit with some CSS, and then we need to come in and make some adjustments just so it works a little better, integrated with Twitter a little bit. So we're going to be going over things like regular expressions, and we're going to be using match as well. So just like in my previous videos, I'll walk you through some of that first. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And I'm going to show you where we're at here. Right now, you can see we have a quote that comes in. All right, and you can see it's a rather long quote, and it kind of goes over all the way over to the edges here, which I'm not too happy with. All right, and if you notice when I tweeted out to Twitter here, you can see that we get something right here. See, -40. All right, so that's kind of a problem. So when we go to tweet this out, it's actually too long. So we're going to fix that with some regular expressions. And the way we're going to do this is I need to use a match is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to be using match here, all right, in order to kind of get my regular expressions into play. So how is that going to work exactly? Well, it's going to be a little different here. All right. Another thing I want to use here is prototype. Let's see where it is, the substring. All right. So if you scroll down in here, again, remember that the documentation is here right through Mozilla is really good. So I'm going to be using this as well. So before we go over that, let's take a look at match. And what match does is it allows me to take a string, all right, and match a regular expression to it. So you can see this RE, all right, chapter, and then a bunch of regular expressions, then I for ignore case. And what we're really looking at is that match is going to return an array. All right. So C chapter, whatever here. All right. That's the whole match of our regular expression. All right. This next piece here is what's captured by just this main capture group here. So the way we access this stuff is going to be an array. Now, if you take a look at some of the documentation a little bit closer, you could see, where are we at here? What do I look at? Here we go. A regular expression includes a G flag. The method returns an array containing all matched substrings rather than match objects. Capture groups are not returned. If there are no matches, it returns null. So essentially, since we only really want one capture group, one main capture group here, the way we're going to do this is we're not actually going to be using this global flag, which is going to take out every single thing and break it up separately into capture groups. So I don't really want the global here. Before we do that, I need to be able to cut down, all right? Cut down because I need to figure out how I'm going to do that. So with substring, I can determine the starting position in my string, remember it's a zero-based index, and my overall length. So I'm just going to do something and just slice my quote off to begin with right away. And that way, I know it's going to be short enough. The problem is I don't want to slice it off in the middle of a word. So that's where match is going to come in to help me just select any word that has, or any string of letters that has a space after it. So I know it's a word, basically, if that makes sense to you. All right. And I'm going to be using regular expressions here. And here's your regular expressions. And you can kind of test things out here. So this is the one I kind of settled in on. That seems to be working. All right. So I need a capture group. In that capture group, all right. And so what this is doing is saying matches any character except for line breaks. So right now it's just saying any character of one or more characters, meaning a word or anything. All right. But how do I say any bunch of characters and then a space? Well, any bunch of characters, no matter what it is, all right, followed by a space. Okay. So followed by a space. Right. So there we go. And that should give us, oh, you want to know what's going on here? It's grabbing everything. I only want the very first thing here. All right, and so it's going to collect everything until you hit a return, or what happens if, all right, if we have like this kind of stuff here, so you can see anything that kind of returns until basically just this word here. All right, so this is what we're going to be returning. We just want one group. We don't want anything kind of hanging here. So we're going to take care of that. Remember, we're going to be using an API here, and our API is still using our key value pairs. All right, and we're going to be using some JSON-P data. Remember, it's a workaround because the JSON data for some reason was not working. So let's take a look at this. I'm also going to fix this sizing. I think that I want this only to be about, I don't know, that wider. So in the center, I don't want it to be so wide. There's a few ways to go around doing that. Before we even do that, let's go down and take a look at some of our JavaScript here. And what I want to do is I just want to add in a conditional, because right now, if we have a short quote, we can just pass it right to Twitter and we're fine. But I want to say if our quote's too long, so you can pick the number of characters you want here. And so if our quote, remember our quote is stored in our variable quote, and you can call length, all right, on any string. So our quote is a string. And if I say that this is greater than, and I think there's 140 something characters you're allowed in Twitter. So, and plus we have hashtags on the end, and you might want to add more hashtags on the end of yours as well by just keep adding in more hashtags here. All right. And if you want to add in more than one, you can just look at the Twitter documentation to figure out how to add in a bunch more hashtags. Plus, as a user, you might want to add in a few more as well. So we'll call it 100. So if you have a really long quote, we want to cut it off and do something else to it. All right. So how do we do this? Well, let's see. Let's open this up. So if this happens, I want to change my quote. All right. So how do I do that? So I'm going to change my quote by setting it equal to quote substring. And I only want this quote to be 100 characters long max. So I want to start at the 0 base index, and I want to end at the 100th character. All right. So we have that right there. And so if you want to save this, all right, I'll run my code. And let's find a long quote that pops up and see what happens. Is that 100 characters? Probably not. Oh, you see what this is. It ends in way. All right, so it just drops off the last two words, and that one ends up pretty well. That doesn't cut off in the middle of a word, so that's okay. Nope, that one was long enough. So you can kind of click through until you find something and try to tweet it out. And you can see sometimes it cuts off in the middle of a word. All right, so you can imagine how that would happen. All right, so that's pretty good. So we already know that that's a problem that we want to fix. So we're going to use a regular expression. And I've kind of messed with this. So this substring still returns a string. All right, so remember, so now we have a new string. So we can actually tack on the back of this a string method. And I'm going to use match. All right, and I played around with this a lot. And then I actually got some internet help. All right, to kind of figure out how to do this. So remember, right, you need 2 slashes. And that says regex, even though right now it's telling me that it's commenting out. But we're going to start our regex. We're going to have our first capture group. All right. So, and then inside this capture group, we have dot plus, right? And so that's going to give us anything that's a string of letters. So any string of letters. And I want any string of letters that is followed by a space. All right. So if you have a string of letters and then followed by a space, what that's going to do is that should give us an entire word. That means we know it's a word. So if we have a bunch of letters and then no space, we know that it's a word that's cut off, and we don't want it that. We just want to drop that off. All right. And this actually returns an array. So we need an array value. Now the array value here, I was kind of playing with, and it seems that when I have it set up this way, now, if you know more about match than I do, which you might be able to provide a clearer explanation for this. But essentially what this seems like it's doing, because of our match, all right, our match properties, you can kind of see how the array itself, it looks like the 0th position is the entire match. And see, here's the logs because it returns an array. So it's logging out an entire array. So the 0th position here is the whole match. So in our case, it's going to have that last word that's not trailing plus a space. Okay. Whereas the first position of the array here is actually going to have all the words without that space, because it's not capturing things that are outside that capture group that I have labeled there. And the capture group is this dot plus, which is just a bunch of things, which is any characters, any string of characters. So I think that's what's going on here. And I could be wrong, but I'm almost positive. Like I said, I'm not that fond of regular expressions, so sometimes I just use them when I have to, and get some help from Stack Overflow and the like, which is helpful. And then I also want to add in, because we're cutting off the quote, we could just add in string ... And that'll cut off our quote nicely, right? And now let's run it. Or we just hit get quote, and let's hopefully find a long one. There's a long one. Tweet it out. Oh, look, it works. And see that? There's no space at the end of this doesn't here. All right, it just doesn't, and then ... All right, if you want a space in there, you can just use the 0th position of that array. So remember, match returns an array. Something else that I want to add in so I can be fancy looking is let everybody know it's a quote. So regardless of whether the quote is over or under 100 characters, I just want to add in quotation marks in that string itself. So how do you do that? Well, you just add in quotation marks. So quote equals. So if you add in, let's say you're used to adding in that, and then you add in one more quotation mark. Oh, the computer gets mad. It does not understand 3 quotation marks. You need to use an escape quote to let it know that the next quote is not paired with the first one. So this is the paired quote. The first and the third quote need to be paired, not the first and the second. Okay, so how do you do that? You can do an escape quote, all right, with your backslash. So quote backslash, meaning escape the next quote, and just put one quotation mark in. Another way to do that, I'll show you too. Plus the actual string itself, quote, and then I want another double quote there. So you can actually use single quotes and double quotes sometimes interchangeably in most things. So there's a single quote. In that single quote, I just put a double quote. So this right here and this right here are doing the same thing. I just did it 2 different ways to kind of show you that either way works. And if I did this correctly, see this if I did it correctly. Oh, look, now I have following, right, trailing this, wherever this last word, or in this case punctuation is, you get ... and the whole thing is in quotes, and I have my hashtag working. The Twitter end is done. All right, look, and look, I still have room, 23. So I still have room to go through and add another hashtag in if I want. Wow, that's pretty cool, right? Nice. Last thing is, I think this is right here. I want to kind of bring this in to maybe, I don't know, somewhere in here, the quote itself, to kind of keep it more centralized, just to make it look nicer. So there's 2 ways to do it. I'm going to use some CSS and the quote container here that I used before. Slide that JavaScript out of the way. But you also can do this by playing with your quote container and this column medium 12, right? You can actually change this column medium 12 to something else and just kind of squish that in by, let's say, column medium 6, okay? And then column medium offset. So now if it's 6 we want in the center, that's going to leave another 6 for either side. So if I divide that in half, I'll get 3 plus 6 plus 3. So I can do something like this and try to like offset it, right, if I want. And then you can rerun your script, and then you can see how wide it is, right? And then you can take this whole thing and recenter it in the center. But I really don't want to do that. So where was that? 12. We actually got to put the offset first, actually. But don't worry about that. You just see how wide it is. I don't really like messing with those bootstraps. So, and even in like the portfolio that I'll show you how to do too. If I don't know if no, I didn't make that video yet. So I'm just going to do this in CSS. It's just a little easier. And not to mention that it allows me to go in and use the same kind of CSS for a bunch of different containers. So I'm just going to mess with this quote container. It just makes it easier for me, so I don't really have to think about like the Twitter stuff here, the Twitter Bootstrap stuff. So I can just call out, because I made this a class, right? So I can say quote container. What do I want to do with my quote container? All right, so I'm going to set a background to my quote container. Background. Be careful you're not mistyping anything. And the background, you can set it to a color, something like that. But what works super good for these is RGBA. RGB for the color and A for alpha. And what that does is that sets the how transparent this div is, this background color is, without having to set an overall opacity on the entire div itself, which will even make the text see-through. You don't want the text to be see-through, just that outside portion. And what you're going to do is give it an RGB value, RGB 0 to 255 each. And I'm going to want white. So it's going to be 255, 255, 255, comma. And now you can set the alpha, which is kind of like the opacity, something from 0 to 1. And I'm going to start off by setting it to 0.5, and I'm going to bring this down a little bit. I'll show you what this looks like. So now it's the full width of that div, which I don't really want. I'm going to go back into my settings now, and I'm going to turn on the auto update for you, so I don't have to keep hitting run. And so that's what 0.5 looks like. And you can see it, I don't know, it's a little bit intrusive, but I'm going to leave it there, and I'll mess with it in a little bit. The color would be the text color, but it's already what I want. It's black, so I'm not going to mess with it. I'm going to want some padding. I don't want this, touching the outside edges of this. So I'm going to add in some padding. All right, so padding. Padding, I'll make, remember to end your sentences here. Padding, you can use pixels for this. So I'll just put in pixels. All right, so I'll give it padding of 50 pixels, no space. And you can kind of see, since I'm going to be viewing this on a little bit bigger screen, so I'll have a nice like buffer all the way around it. So it kind of floats in the center of that table. All right, let's see. How about the width? I don't want this full width. But remember, I'm using container fluid, so it's going to be dynamically changing with screen size, okay? Since it's dynamically changing with screen size, I'm going to set the width as a percentage of the screen. So for now, let's just set it at 75%. Okay. There you go. So now you can see how wide it is. The next thing you want to take a look at here is the margins. How do we get this centered? So remember how I said in the first video, you can change your classes here with your column, medium, and all this kind of stuff to figure out where you want to put these individual pieces within the div. You can slide them around for the image that you're using itself. Well, another easy way, if you want to slide around your entire quote container, which is nice, is you can actually take margin, right? That's a auto. Okay. And then margin left There you go. Bounces right in the center. And so now you can come up here and play with how wide you want it. On this image here, that looks about right because you can see the padding and how it just barely overlaps the clouds here. And that looks pretty good. I can always bring this down a little bit like that. All right, if I think that looks a little better. And you can see how it's much easier to kind of play with this in the CSS than it would be to mess with the HTML. So that's how come I like to play with this in CSS. Plus, I can use the same template over and over again when I want certain divs and containers broken up on my web pages. I can actually copy and paste some of this stuff in and out. And this is just annoying me, so I'm going to fix that right now. All right. Something else that I like to do, I don't like the way that this is blocked off. So I'm going to just give it a border radius. And you've done this before in freeCodeCamp. Radius. If you're using a text editor, it'll start auto-filling these in, so you know you're not going to get syntax errors, which is really nice. You could do this percentage or pixels. Let's do, I don't know. Let's see what 25 pixels looks like. Yeah, okay. That looks good enough. You can play with it. This font. All right. You can use font size. And again, since this is going to be dynamic, you can just multiply by a certain amount. So you can use EM for that. So I'm going to use 1.1 EM. And then you're going to see what's going to happen. All right, see how it's just a little bit bigger. All right, and you can kind of mess with this and see how big or small you want it. So you can mess with your font size and the relative screen sizes very easily just by changing a simple number, right, depending on how big you want the quote. And still, because it's a P tag, you can see how it still looks very different than our titles and stuff, where it's just the actual font itself. So you can adjust it. Make it a little bigger. All right, so there's your font size. And we can take a look at the bottom. And let's say you want say these buttons are a little too close. So use bottom or adding bottom to push these buttons a little bit further away. I don't know. See what 5% looks like. See if that's too much. That's too much. Yeah, it's better. And all I'm doing is adding a little more space at the bottom here for the buttons. All right. And so now I can kind of play with what this looks like. I still think that white is a little too white. So I'm going to play with the alpha up here. That in half. Maybe 2. 5. There we go. All right. I like that. I like that a lot. So I'm going to change my view, give you the full page view of my app. And there we go. It's very slight. And if I get my quotes, it'll kind of fill through. And you can see that it kind of stays where I want it. This little white background just gives us that little bit of extra offset or contrast from the background image itself. Okay. And if you want that more pronounced, less pronounced, you could do that as well. Also, if you want your buttons to stand away from this, you can also add in, put this in a div, add in padding. Sometimes I'll actually add in a separate div called spacer if I'm looking to space all of my elements evenly through the page, and I'll make that a total percentage of the width of the page, like 5%, 20%, and it'll separate my elements out. That way I don't have to worry about it, and I can just drop them in HTML and then change the spacing of everything in my page with one number on the CSS for that padding element. So just another tip that I like to do. It just kind of makes things easier for me, just the way I like to do it. All right, so at this point, you have a completely built quote machine. All right, we've used CSS, we've picked up some regular expressions, we've used match, we've overviewed the API, we've integrated Twitter, we've got some cool buttons. So that pretty much concludes this project. So hopefully you had some fun and learned something. And I'll see you on the next project. See ya.